Masechet Gittin, Daf Pe Aleph. We hope to complete the 8th perek today. Mishnah teaches, Katav legaresh et ishto v'nimlach, Bet Shammai omerim pesala min ha'kehuna. ובית הלל אומרים, אף על פי שנתנו לה על תנאי ולא נעשה תנאי, לא פסלה מן הכהונה. If someone a husband wrote a get to his wife, but then changed his mind, and even though he wrote the get, he did not deliver it. So, obviously, they are not divorced. Nevertheless, Bet Shammai says that she does become disqualified from marrying a Kohen afterwards. So, from the biblical law, a divorcee cannot marry a Kohen. So if they actually were divorced, that would be a biblical prohibition. But Bet Shammai says, even though they weren't actually divorced, he only wrote the get, he never delivered it, nevertheless is something that we'll call reach haget, a scent of a get. There's now already going to be rumors, statements. There was the thought of giving a get already indicates some tension. And so Bet Shammai is very machmir and says we want to keep away even someone who was potentially thought of being divorced already cannot marry a Kohen. Now, this person, if she is married to a Kohen, she can stay married. It doesn't dissolve the marriage. But if the husband dies, then she will not be allowed to marry a Kohen after that, like a divorcee. But of course, it's midrabanan. So that's how strict Bet Shammai is keeping Kohanim away, even from someone who might have been divorced, who had a get written about her. Bet Hillel, however, disagrees, and they say even if the husband wrote a get and gave a get to the wife with a condition, and the condition was not fulfilled, so therefore the get is nullified, even in that case, she can, let's say the husband dies afterwards, she can go ahead and marry a Kohen, because even though she received the get, it never took effect, so therefore she's not a divorcee. So that will be like opposite extreme from Bet Shammai. Now, Shalach le Rav Yosef beret Rab Menashe medivir l'Shmuel. Ilamdenu Rabenu, yasa alav kol ish peloni kohen katav get l'ishto v'yoshev tachtav u'mshamashto mahu. So now that we know that Mishnah, the halacha of the Mishnah, here we have a practical question that Rav Yosef, the son of Rab Menashe from a place called Devil, asked the Amorah Shemuel, who was the Rosh Yeshiva in Nehar Da'ah. Can our master teach us, what about a case where there's a rumor that this person wrote a get to his wife? Now we'll see, the word wrote, does that mean just wrote, or does that imply also wrote and gave? Anyway, but they're still living together, and she is still serving him the way a wife serves a husband, and so it looks like they're still married, even though there's divorce. There's a rumor that he wrote a divorce for her. So what would be the case? Should we trust that rumor has something to it and make them separate? What should we do? Shelach le tesev adabar sarich bedika. Shemuel sent back, says yes, they have to separate, and we have to investigate, right? And because there is this rumor, and we have to take this rumor seriously. Now, we're going to talk about rumors in a couple of dapim from now, different kinds of rumors, and when we have to take it seriously and when not. So now, Maihi, let's see, what is the case? Ilemadi mebatilinan kala, or la mebatilinan, ve'anar de'a atred Shmuelu benhar de'a la mebatili kala. What required investigation, right? What's up for discussion? If it's the question of, do we abolish a rumor? In other words, in general, when we hear some rumor, do we ignore it, or do we not ignore it and we take it seriously and we can't just abolish it? Well, that we know the answer, because Nehar De'ah was the place of Shemuel, and in Nehar De'ah they have the practice not to abolish a rumor. They act on rumors. We'll talk about how substantiated a rumor has to be before it's not just gossip, but apparently in Nehar De'ah, the gossipers, right, check their sources to some degree, and therefore they would act on it. So it's not about that. Rather, we want to investigate in that place, when they say the word kitiva, do they mean only writing, or do they mean writing and giving, right? He wrote a get to his wife, and they say that even if it was also given. Okay, so that would make a difference, because if the word writing means wrote and gave in that place, then certainly we have to separate them, because now there's a rumor that he wrote and gave a get to his wife. Now, we ask about that. Okay, even if in that place they do, when they say kitiva, they sometimes mean kitiva, writing and giving. But what if it's just writing? Wouldn't they also call that writing? There's no other word for it, right? So that means kitiba has two meanings. Sometimes it means just writing. Sometimes it means writing and giving. So therefore, why should we assume that he gave it? Maybe he only wrote it and didn't give it. And so why did Shemuel say that they have to separate? And we say, says, indeed, that's enough. Even if it's ambiguous, an ambiguous word, if we see that sometimes by the word kitiva they mean writing and giving, then there's a good chance that it was actually given, and therefore we have to be machmir and make them separate. Now we ask, we're going to make them separate? Hold on, Rav Asher has a principle that anytime you have a rumor, but the couple is already married and the rumor comes out after the marriage, we ignore the rumor. If the couple is not married yet, and there's some rumor, I heard that she was a divorcee, she's not married yet, then the rabbis will say, okay, don't get married, right? We're not going to allow this marriage to go through until this matter is settled and we dispel the rumor or not. So that's before they're married. But if they're already married, then we don't break up a marriage because of a rumor. And so here, it's only a rumor, so why should we break up the marriage? Mai teseh, name teseh misheni. And we answer, no, when it says leave, we don't mean that she should leave the husband that she is currently married to, but that if that husband dies and she marries a second guy, then she has to leave that second guy because the rumor came out before she married that second guy, and therefore we're going to make her separate. But this first current guy, in fact, you're right, she can stay with him. Okay, so hold on, that doesn't really help her, because if you're going to make her separate from the second guy because of this rumor, then people are going to say, oh, what happened? Right? Something happened with her first marriage? Well, and then where there was some kind of divorce? Well, then you're going to have a suspicion about the children that were born from the first one. Maybe they were born after this divorce, and therefore they are not proper Kohanim. They're going to be halalim. And so now you're going to, even though you're only separating the second marriage, it's going to cause problems for the first marriage also. And we have a principle that we're not going to intervene in the first marriage since the rumor came out afterwards. And so we answer that, and so we answer, no, since we are separating her from the second marriage and not the first marriage, so the gossipers have certain tendencies, right? They only have pieces of information, but they put it together in some kind of recognizable pattern. And so therefore, they will assume that he wrote this get and perhaps gave this get soon before he died. Therefore, the children from the first marriage are all kosher, right? They were perfectly kosher. They had those children when they were fully married, before any get or any problem. And therefore, this rumor, if it were true, must have happened only right before his death. And that's why the rabbis did not separate the first marriage. And so the children, their reputation will be protected, right? If anything, they'll say, oh, well, maybe it happened at the end of the first marriage, and therefore she was a divorcee, and the second marriage is a problem. And so that's in fact what it means, only the second marriage. So you see with this, because of this statement of Rav Asher, where significantly downgrading the consequences that Shemuel had answered, right? So you see this tension within the sugya of how seriously we should take rumors, and of course, someone who is confirmed to be a divorcee cannot marry a kohen, but in cases where we have some doubt, how do we act is the challenge, and is what's being argued by these different sages. Okay, next case. Amar Abba bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Bishum Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai, Bore shelo kadorot harishonim, dorot haacharonim, dorot harishonim bet Shammai, dorot haacharonim be Rabbi Dosa. So Rabbi Abba bar Chana says the name of Rabbi Yochanan and the name of Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai. Come and see that the earlier generations were much more pious than the later later generations. The early generations is represented by Bet Shammai in our Mishnah, and the later generations by Rabbi Dosa. And the piety is, but in particular, in how strict they are regarding the lineage of Kohanim. Titanya Shebuya Ochelit Bitruma Divrei Rabbi Dosa. So the Rishonim, that's what we already said. Bet Shammai says even if a husband just wrote a get to his wife and didn't give it, already that's a suspicion of a get. That's like a reach get. It says that we treat it as if he gave it to her. She is enough. Her husband thought about and acted upon divorcing her, even though he didn't go through with it. Already, that's too much. So BC Bet Shammai is very stringent about this, and this is the opposite of Rabbi Dosa. Rabbi Dosa says that if a wife was taken captive, she can and then redeemed, she is permitted to still eat teruma, if her husband is a kohen. Now here's the law: if someone is, if a wife is taken against her will, and raped. If the husband is Israel, then there's no consequence. She can go back to her husband. If it's not called adultery because she was not willing. However, if it's a kohen, if the husband is a kohen, then even if she was unwilling and she was raped, she cannot go back to her husband. So now when a woman is taken captive, now we're not sure what happened. Did the captives violate her? What did they do? So since we're not sure, Rabbi Dosa says, okay, even though they were taken captive, there's no reason to assume that the captives had physical relations with her, and therefore we'll assume not so, and therefore she can go back to her husband, and she can even continue to eat teruma as the wife of a kohen. And Rabbi Dosa explains his reasoning. Amar Rabbi Dosa, v'chi me'asa laha aravi zeh mipnei shemi'ech la ben dadeha pesala min hakehuna. So what did this Arab, assuming it was an Arab, maybe they were people who traveled around and often kidnapped people, like Bedouin, whatever. Anyway, so this guy, this Arab who captured this woman, well, what did he do? He pressed himself against her. So he may very well have sexually abused her, but it doesn't mean that he actually had intercourse with her. And as long as he didn't do that, so she is not disqualified from being with the Kohen. So therefore, we can assume in a case of doubt that that relations did not happen, penetration did not happen, and therefore she is okay. Okay, so that was the first comment of Rabba bar Hana. And similarly, Rabba bar Hana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli, the same series of sages. Bor eshelo kadorot harishonim dorot ha'acharonim. Dorot harishonim machnisin perotem derech tarak semon. כדי לחייבן במעשה. דורות האחרונים מכניסים פירותיהן דרך גגות ודרך קרפיפות כדי לפוטרן מן המעשר. אמר רבי יונאי, אין התבל מתחייב במעשר עד שיראה פני הבית, שנאמר, ביארתי הקודש מן הבית. We'll start with the last halacha, which is, Rabbi Yonai teaches that tebel, produce that grows on one's field, you have to give maaser, but you don't have to give maaser when it's still out in the field, and you're permitted to eat from it casual, not a full meal, but just a snack from it. It's only liable in maaser once it is ready to eat, and that means when you bring it into the home. As the pasuk says regarding vidui maaser, a farmer has to say, I have taken out, destroyed the holy items from my house. If there was any maaser, he has to make sure to give it to the proper person. So that means it was in the house. So we learn from there that it's not liable to maaser until it gets into the house. Okay, we learn from that the maaser produce is only liable in giving maaser if you bring it into the front door of the house, which is the normal way to do it. But if you bring it in from some other way, then it's a loophole to get around giving maaser. So that's the comment here. Look how the early generations are not like the later generations. In the early generations, they would bring their produce into the house through the main entryway so that it would be chayav and maaser, and they were happy to give maaser. What a wonderful mitzvah. right, to support the Leviim, to support the poor people, to go and eat it in Jerusalem. And so they would make sure to make themselves liable. But the later generations, they would bring the produce into their homes by the ways of roofs or other enclosures, so that they can get around the laws, and that way they could have it in the house and they would eat from it casually, and they did not have to give maaser. So look how they don't want to, they're trying to get out of maaser. So that's a parallel to the previous statement about the earlier and later generations. Added to Rabbi Yochanan thinks not only bringing it into the front entrance of a house makes it liable to maaser, but even bringing it into the courtyard, someone's courtyard, is also makes it liable, as it says, and they will eat within your gates. So gates, that's into the courtyard. So maaser is also chayav, not only from the front door, but also into the courtyard. Next Mishnah. Hamigaresh et ishto velana imo bepundeki. Bet Shammai אומרים אינה צריכה ממנו גט שני, ובית הלל אומרים צריכה ממנו גט שני. Someone gives a get to his wife. All right, so then they should be divorced. But here's the problem. Then they travel together and they go and sleep, and they're in a hotel together, right? They're secluded in a hotel room together. So we're not sure. Do we know what happened in that hotel room or not? The Gemara will discuss. Bet Shammai says they do not require a second get, either because we assume that they did not have relations, or that if they did have relations, it was as in promiscuous and not for the sake of kiddushin. So therefore, the get is they divorced themselves beforehand, and there's no new marriage here. Bet Hillel, however, omerihim siricha menu get. Bet Hillel assumes that they did sleep together, and that they had in mind that this would be for kiddushin. And therefore, even though they got divorced, now they are married once again. And so they're going to need a second get. Ematai, בזמן שנתגרשה מן הנישואין המודים, ונתגרשה מן האירוסין שאינה צריכה ממנו גט שני מפני שאין ליבו גס בה. Now, when is this true? Only if they were fully married with nisu'in. But they agree that, let's say they only did kiddushin, which they did separate in time from nisu'in back then. They only had kiddushin, and then they were in a hotel room together. So everyone agrees, even Bet Hillel, who is more machmir in this case, that second get is not required because he is not accustomed to her. Since they only did kiddushin, so they never slept together. Probably they did kiddushin with money, not with biyah. Even if with biyah it's only one time, so they're not accustomed to each other. Therefore, even if they were in a hotel room together, we assume that they did not have relations, and therefore everybody agrees that a second get is not required. The machloket is only when they were already married. And so therefore they're accustomed to each other, so then there's more reason to suspect that if they were in a hotel room together, then they probably had relations. And if they had relations, it could be for kiddushin, and in that case, Bet Hillel requires a second get. Amar Rabba bar Hana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, same sage we had before, comments on this Mishnah as well. Machloket b'shera'u hasheni v'ala, de Bet Shammai sabre, Adam oseh be'ilato be'ilat zinut. So this machloket in the Mishnah is only when there are witnesses that actually know that they had relations, not just that they saw them check into a hotel room together. And so that's the case where there's machloket. Bet Shammai says that they had relations. Even though they had relations, a person would have relations of that are promiscuous and not want to be married again with that relations. And therefore they are not married again. Bet Hillel thinks higher of people, that a person would not want to have promiscuous relations, and therefore if he's with his wife, he must have had in mind that he wants this bi'ah to be for kiddushin, and therefore they're married again, and that would require a second get. Ava lo ra'uha. But if the witnesses did not see that they did anything, they know that they checked into the hotel, but no, we have no confirmation that they actually had bi'ah. Everyone would agree, even Bet Hillel would agree, that we do not require a second get. There's no reason to assume that they had relations together. Okay, Tanan, we're going to challenge now this statement of Rabbi Yochanan, who explained the Mishnah to the machloket to be only in that specific case. It doesn't make sense with the sefad of the Mishnah. Tenan, umodim beshenit karesha min ha'erusin she'ena sricha menu get sheni she'en li bo gasba. It says that in the Mishnah, it says they agree if they only had Kiddushin and then they were together in a hotel room, they only had Kiddushin. They got divorced and then they were in a hotel room. Everyone agrees that you do not require a second get because they're not accustomed to each other. And therefore we assume that they did not have relations. So now we ask, if the witnesses actually saw that they had relations, then what does it matter if it's erusin or nisuin? Obviously, they had relations, and so they did kiddushin, and then there's a get, and then witnesses saw them in a hotel with bi'ah. So obviously that they did have bi'ah, so it wouldn't matter if it was only erusin before or nisuin before. So there's no way to interpret this clause of the Mishnah according to Rabbi Yochanan. Rather, the Mishnah itself is assuming that the witnesses did not see what happened. Okay, so let's review. The Mishnah is assuming the witnesses only saw them check into a hotel. They went to a hotel room together. We don't know what happened. If there was only kiddushin and divorce before that, we assume they're not accustomed to each other, and we assume nothing happened. If they had nisuin and then got divorced, then we're not sure what happened, and that's why Bet Shammai says, well, we don't know what happened. That's okay. They don't need a get. Maybe they didn't have relations. Bet Hillel, on the other hand, says we assume they did have relations and it was for kiddushin, and they require a second get. That's the reading of the Mishnah. And Rabbi Yochanan, when he said his statement that there was no machloket, in the case that machloket is only when we know that they had relations, the witnesses say so. He is not following our Mishnah, rather the Tana of a different Braita. The Tanya. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Lo nechluku bet Shammai bet Hillel al shelo ra'u hashniv'ala, shena siricha hemenu get sheni. Right? This is the Tana is Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, and he says, Rabbi Yochanan just quoting him, that Bet Shammai bet Hillel do not disagree. Right? They agree when that when they did not see anything, and you don't require a second get, right? If we don't know, we saw them go into a hotel room, but we don't know what happened, so then there's no reason to have any suspicion. Alma nechleku al sheroa sheniv'ala shebet Shammai omrim adam oseh be'ilato be'ilat zenut, bet Hillel omrim en adam oseh be'ilato be'ilat zenut. So where is the machloket? Again, according to the Braita only. According to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, it's only when the witnesses did see. Bet Shammai says that a person would have promiscuous relations, which it's not good to have promiscuous relations, but it does help in terms of this, that they're not now remarried. So you don't need a second get. Bet Hillel says a person would not have promiscuous relations. He must have had in mind to do a second kiddushin and get remarried, and that's why they need a second get. All right, that's true. That's Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar's interpretation of Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, which is different from our Mishnah's interpretation, because our Mishnah assumes that the witnesses do not know if they had bi'ah or not. Okay. Matnitin de'okimna belora u hasheniv ala b'mai pelige dika ede yichud veleka ede bi'ah. So now back to our Mishnah, which we already established is talking about a case where the witnesses did not see any actual bi'ah. They only saw them check into the hotel. So, right, what's the basis of this machloket? So there are witnesses of yichud that they checked into a hotel. There are no witnesses that saw an actual bi'ah. And what's the two reasonings? Bet Shammai sabre lo amrinan hen ade yichud vehen hen ade bi'ah. Bet Hillel sabre amrinan hen ade yichud vehen hen ade bi'ah. Bet Shammai says just because you have witnesses for yichud, that's not the same as witnesses for bi'ah. So maybe they went in and they just watched the movie. We don't know. We shouldn't assume anything happened. They don't require anything. And Bet Hillel says witnesses that saw them with yichud, that counts as witnesses that saw relations. We do assume they had relations, and then we also further assume that it's for kiddushin. Umodim beshenit karesha min ha'erusin she'ena sricha hemenu get sheni dechavan de'en libo gasba lo amrinan hen ede bi'ah. And then this is just explaining the continuation of the Mishnah. that if they only had kiddushin and then got divorced, then we do not require a second get because they are not accustomed to each other, and therefore he is not accustomed to her, and therefore we do not assume that the witnesses that saw them secluded should also count as witnesses that saw bi'ah, so we don't assume bi'ah, and therefore Bet Hillel would agree that you do not require a second get. And now we wonder, wait a second, is that true that Rabbi Yochanan followed that baraita only? Rabbi Yochanan also said that halacha in this case is like our Mishnah, the anonymous voice of our Mishnah, and we just established that the Mishnah is assuming that the witnesses did not see anything. So how could it be that Rabbi Yochanan is following the baraita that says it's talking about that machloket is in a case where they did see something, the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. So we have a contradiction between two statements of Rabbi Yochanan, and the answer is Amora Enin Hu V'Alibad Rabbi Yochanan. In fact, there is a machloket between two Amoraim about what Rabbi Yochanan said. Rabbi Yochanan taught something, and it was transmitted differently by two different sets of Tanaim. Okay, next case. Kenasa beget kereach tese mize umize v'chol haderachim ha'elu ba. If a woman was divorced with a get kereach, literally a bald get, and then she got remarried to a second husband based on that get, so she has to leave both the first and second husbands and gets all the penalties that we mentioned before. Now, what is a get kereach? This is one that is folded and tied get. It's a get that is made in a special way so that it won't be tampered with. It's very hard to forge such a get, and so some witness signs on each fold, and then it's folded and tied, and again that. Now, it's supposed to be the proper way to do this is for a witness to sign on every single fold. That would be a proper get. A bald get is one that has two signatures. That's the minimum you need for any get, is two valid signatures, but then there's empty folds. So that's a problem. Now we'll say why. Get kereach hakol mashlimin alav dibre ben nanas. Now those empty parts, according to ben nanas, anybody can sign them. Even someone who would be an invalid witness, as long as you have two valid witnesses, the rest of them can be invalid witnesses. However, Rabbi Akiva omer en mashlimin alav ela kirobim hareuin la'id b'makom acher. Rabbi Akiva says that it has to be someone who could be a valid witness in a different case, even if not in this marriage, because they're related. So in other words, you can have relatives as long as those relatives are of proper lineage, not a slave, and not a gambler, not a thief, and so on. So as long as they are generally a kosher witness, even if they are not kosher for this particular marriage because they're related, that those people can sign on the empty folds as long as you have two totally valid witnesses. What is a get kereach? Anytime you have the folds and ties are more than the witnesses. For every fold, you need to have a witness. If there are some folds that are empty and with no witness, that's called a bare get. My ta'amad get kereach. What's the reason why this type of get is no good? Because we worry, since the husband made a get, let's say with 7 folds, and so he's expecting 7 people are going to sign it. So we suspect that maybe there were 7 people there, and he said, I want all of you to sign the get. And if he uses that language, it's only a valid get if all 7 actually sign it. If one of them doesn't sign it, it's not a valid get at all. So since that is a likely case that could happen, we make a gezerah that anytime you make a get kereach, you have to make sure that all of the folds are signed, so that we should not make a mistake in a case where he actually said kulechem. Even though from the letter of the law, it will be enough to have 2 witnesses. Now, get kereach hakol mashlimin alav. According to Ben Anas, anyone can sign on those empty lines. even a disqualified person. Rabbi Akiva, however, says only a relative can sign, but not other disqualifications. So, for example, an Eved is not a good slave. Why? How come that person would not be good? Because if people see that his signature is on it, they'll say, "Oh, look, I guess this person is fit to be a witness. I guess slaves are fit to be witnesses." They'll come to a wrong conclusion, and therefore here, even though it's just an extra witness and is not literally necessary, we don't want people to come to the false conclusion. Well, if that's the reason, it doesn't make sense, because a relative also, people will say, "Oh, look, his brother signed on this get here. I guess a brother is allowed to be a kosher witness," and so they'll make the same mistake in other cases. So that can't be the reason why an Eved is no good. Oh, maybe we can't have put a slave there, because then they'll say, "Oh, this person is signed. We thought he was a slave." Well, I guess not. I guess he has proper lineage and he's not a slave after all, even though he actually is a slave. And so we'll come to the wrong conclusion. Well, then in that case, Gazlan de Bar Yochasin, and we wouldn't make that mistake regarding a relative, because a relative is already a kosher person. So that's okay if people think that this brother is a kosher person. So this is a better answer than the previous one. However, it also runs into trouble. Gazlan de Bar Yochasin hu litachshar. A thief is also someone of good lineage, right? You can have someone from a good family, not avadim, no problem in the no mamzerim, no problem in the family, even though he's a terrible thief. So therefore a thief should be okay, because if your only problem with a slave is that people will think he's of good lineage, then a gazlan who no one will think, who is already of good lineage, and no one will come to make that mistake, that should also be allowed. But Rabbi Akiva said no. Allah matenan, Rabbi Akiva omer en mashlimin alav ela kerobim aruin la'id b'makom acher karov in gazlan la. Rabbi Akiva said we can only fill in the blank folds with relatives who can be witnesses in other cases. That's true for a relative, but not for a thief. Rather, the reason for the disqualifications are because in the case of a slave, we see that that signature on it will say, "Oh, I guess he was a slave, but he freed him, and the Mir must be free," even though it's not true. And the Gazlan, if he signs, will say, "Oh, I know he used to be a thief. I guess he made teshuvah, and now he's valid to be a witness," even though it's not true. And then people will falsely think that he could be a good witness for other things. And so that explains the both of them. Karov ma'ikal memar. But if someone's a relative, what are we afraid of that they might say that is wrong? Karov kula mayad ete karov hu. Everybody knows who's related to whom, and everybody knows this guy's a brother of that person. So they're not going to come to think, "Oh, I guess he's not a brother," right? Everybody knows who's related, and then they will figure it out. Oh, it was just an extra signature on this get, and that's why it was permitted. But they're not going to come to any problematic false conclusion, and that's why Rabbi Akiva permitted. He agreed with Ben Anas that a relative can be an extra signature, but for other cases of invalid witnesses, he was afraid that people then would come to some wrong conclusion. This brings us to the last sugya. Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rabba bar She'ilta, Amar Rav Hamnuna Saba, Amar Rav Ada bar Ahava. It's a good idea to actually remember some of these names, because they're going to be quoting each other again in questions and answers. Rabbi Zera said in the name of Rabba, the son of She'ilta, who said in the name of Rav Hamnuna, the elder, who said in the name of Rav Ada bar Ahava. Get kereach kesharav shiv'a ve'edav shisha, shisha ve'edav hamisha, hamisha ve'edav arba'a, arba'a ve'edav shelosha. Ad kan mahloket ben Nanas ve'Rabbi Akiva. Aval kesharav shelosha ve'edav shenayim, divrei hakol en mashlemin alav ela karom. So the statement says that you have this kind of bald get. Now, this type of get that is folded over and sewn and signed on each one, which is difficult to authenticate, difficult to forge, rather, also takes time to make. And the more folds and more signs, the longer it will make. And the rabbis like this one, this type of get, not only because it's hard to forge, but also especially if it's a kohen who's divorcing his wife. If you make it a big effort to make the get, that will take a long time. It's going to take, a half hour, 2 hours. And in the meantime, hopefully the Kohen, if he has any regrets, will not go ahead with it, because if he does, he cannot remarry her. Okay. So anyway, if you have this get kereach and you have 7 folds and ties, so then you technically need 7 signatures. But let's say you're missing one, you have only 6. Or if you have 6 folds and you have only 5 signatures, or 5 folds and only 4 signatures, or 4 folds and only 3 signatures. The Gemara will tell us in a second why it's giving us these details like this. Just say, there's less folds, less signatures than folds. Why does it have to be always one less? Gemara will say, yes, specific, has to be one less. Anyway, this in all these cases, that's the machloket between Ben Nanas and Rabbi Akiva, where Ben Nanas says anybody could sign the last one, even someone who is pasul, like Aved or a thief. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, it can be a relative, but not anyone who else, not any other type of pasul. That's where their disagreement is. However, if it has only 3 folds and 2 witnesses, everyone agrees that the last one has to be a relative. Even Ben Nanas would agree with that. Why? For a regular get, you need 2 witnesses. That's the minimum. For this type of get mikushad, this tied get, you need at least 3 witnesses. We're going to see, it's really midrabanan that you need them. But because the minimum is 3 witnesses, in other words, if you have to come and ratify this get afterwards, someone says, hey, this is not good, you have to ratify. In the regular get, you have to ratify only 2 signatures, even if there's more. Whereas in this type of get, you have to ratify 3 signatures. Because 3 is the minimum, so even Ben Nanas would agree that the last one cannot be a thief or an Ayaved. He would agree with Rabbi Akiva that it has to be a karov or a fully good witness. Amar le Rabbi Zera le Rabba bar Sheilta. Now, even though Rabbi Zera quoted this halacha in the name of Rabba bar Sheilta, he also had a question, and when he heard it, he says, I have a question about that. Mikedi kol shelosha b'mkushar, kishnayim b'pashut ameh. Ma'atam karov la, afacha nameh karov la. He says, we understand that 3 witnesses in a tied get is like 2 witnesses in a regular get. In other words, that's the minimum. So just like regarding a regular get, you need 2 totally good witnesses, relatives are no good. So too here, since the minimum is 3, we should require 3 totally good witnesses and not allow a relative. For the 4, 5, 6, so that you have a relative, I understand. But since 3 is the minimum, why are you telling me that everybody agrees that a karov is okay? It should be that a karov would not be okay. Amar le, and so Rabba bar Sheilta says, Af lididi kashyali. Oh, when I heard the halacha, I had the same question that you did. And so I asked Rav Hamnuna, that's who he heard it from. Sheilted le Rav Hamnuna, Rav Hamnuna le Rav Ada bar Ahava. And Rav Hamnuna himself, he asked that question to Rav Ada bar Ahava, who's the first person that we have on the list, the oldest that the tradition comes from. So you're asking a good question. The question goes all the way up the line. And the answer that Rav Ada bar Ahava gave to Rav Hamnuna, I will tell you. ואמר הנח לשלושה במקושר תלאו דאורייתא. It says, no, leave the 3rd one in a get mikushar because it's not deoraita. When you have a regular get, it's 2 witnesses the minimum, that's midoraita. Therefore, they have to be fully good witnesses, not relatives. But in the get mikushar, since the 3rd one is a derabanan requirement, we can be somewhat lenient. We're not going to allow an Eved. Even Ben Nanas will not allow that. But to be a relative, that's okay. Tanana mehachi, we have a braita. This is the very same thing. Get kereach kesharav shib'a ve'adav shisha. Shisha ve'adav hamisha. Hamisha ve'adav arba'a. Arba'a ve'adav shelosha. Ad kan machloket Ben Nanas ve'Rabbi Akiva. Braita is exactly the same phrasing as we had before. This type of bold get, if it has 7 ties and has only 6 signatures, or 6 and only 5 signatures, or has 5 folds and only 4 signatures, 4 folds and only 3 signatures, then in all those cases, Ben Nanas says anybody can sign the extra, whereas Rabbi Akiva says no, it has to be a relative or kosher, totally kosher witness. Hishlim alav ayabed Ben Nanas omer havalad kasher, Rabbi Akiva omer havalad mamzer. If in any of those cases an ayabed was the last one to fill out, the missing fold, Ben Anas said totally fine, because that's Ben Anas's opinion. Anybody can sign the extra folds. Whereas Rabbi Akiva says, no, the child will be mamzer, because he says Eved is no good. It has to be, at worst, a relative or someone totally kosher. But if you have only 3 folds and 2 witnesses, then everyone agrees that the last one has to be either a relative or a kosher witness, cannot be an Eved. Even Ben Anas would agree to that. So that Braita is exactly what the tradition was that we just saw. Rav Yosef matne kasher. Now we have a different version of this Braita where it says if you have only 3 folds and therefore you have 2 signatures, the missing signature cannot be a karov, it has to be a kasher, someone that's not an Eved, not a thief, not related, a totally good, kosher, valid ed. This would be like the question that we had before, right? The question was, well, since 3 is a minimum, so the third one should be kasher. We said, no, it's Rabbanan. But this version of the Braita says, no, since they require 3, even if it's Rabbanan, the rabbis make things, whenever they make something, they're going to make it like a Doraita law. So it has to be kasher. We ask, V'atanya karov. Wait a second, we have this Braita that says karov. Amar Papa, Taneh kasher. No, change the language of the Braita. And then, in fact, to make it kasher, and so that's a different version of the Braita. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, lo hchshiru bo ela ayed ehad karov bilbad, aval tereh la adir ma'ateh lakayumeh betereh kirobim v'had kasher. Yochanan says, when the rabbi said, either Ben Anas said you could use anyone, or Rabbi Akiva says I can use a karov, that's only one of the signatures, but you can't have 2 or more of such invalid signatures. Why? Because when you come to validate the get, someone says, hey, that get is no good. You know, let's say there's 10 folds and 10 signatures on the get. You don't have to validate all of them. You only have to validate 3 of them. Here's the problem. If let's say 2 or more out of the 10 are related, then we don't know which ones they're going to end up validating. And you could end up having that 2 of the 3 signatures you're validating are relatives, and only 1 is a kosher witness. And that would be under the deoraita minimum. Whereas if you have only 1 relative, then any 3 that you pick, that most will have just 1 relative, and 2 totally kosher witnesses. And so you're good, you're covered on the deoraita level. You have 2 kosher witnesses, and then the other one, if it's a karov, that will be okay. So therefore, you can only have 1 extra, 1 invalid witness. Amar Rav Asher, matnitan nameh daika, deka medaleg v'taneh had shema'min. Rav Asher says, the Braita that we just quoted actually supports this, that only 1 can be an invalid witness because of the formulation. It says if there are 7 folds and only 6 folds and only 5 signatures, it always says only 1 missing. Why not just say if there are more folds than signatures? Then it would say any amount. We would think any amount. From the fact that it gives many examples with only 1 difference is a good proof for that law of Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Abaye, Shema Amina, Hai Karov Hatim, Iba'eh ben Batechila, ben Ba'emsa, ben Basof. Abaye says we can learn from this that the relative, if you have 1 missing, the relative can sign. It doesn't really matter where he signs. It could be he's the first one, or the middle one, or he could be the last signature. Mimai, how does Abaye know that? Midela Kaba Lemakom, because in the Braita it doesn't say where it is. It just says there's 7 folds and there's 6 signatures. It doesn't say it's the beginning or at the middle or the end. And since it doesn't say so, it could be anywhere. We can further infer from the Braita that when we come to ratify the get, we can pick any 3, and it doesn't have to be 3 in a row. You don't need 1, 2, 3, or 2, 3, 4, right? Or if you have 10 of them, 7, 8, 9, 8, 9, 10. Could be any. You could pick 1, 3, and 6, 2, 5, and 10. Any 3 is fine. They don't have to be in order. Why? How do we know that? Because if we require that the 3 that we use to ratify are in a row, then we could have even more invalid signatures, meaning signatures of relatives. Because here's what we could do. We could put the relatives as spot number 1, And then 2 and 3 will be good. 4 and 5 or 6 will be good, right? And then 7 will be another invalid witness. And then 10 also, you can have as invalid witnesses as long as they're 2 or more apart. Any set of 3 in a row will have only one relative and 2 kosher witnesses. And so, from the fact that we just said we require, there has to be only one, at max, only one relative, and not more, means that the problem is we could potentially pick any 3. And we don't know where the relative is going to be. It could be at any place, and they could be together. And so that's why we have to have only one, so that no matter which 3 we pick, since we could pick from any of them, even out of order, even not consecutive, we will have only one at max, and have the 2 deoraita minimum for kosher witnesses. When there was an actual case and it came to the Bi Ameh, and they had this kind of get with folds and it was missing one, he said, go get even a slave from the marketplace to come and sign it. That is the opinion of Ben Nanas, showing that. So he followed Ben Nanas, and he didn't require it to be just a relative and someone with no other pisulim. So he followed the opinion of Ben Nanas. Hadran alach hazorek, hazakim uberuchim.